So that's a great sort of thought to. This happens again and again in philosophy, because when Bertrand Russell actually, when he's reflecting on this, and he was saying, I'm considering this. I think he wrote an essay which is in one of his more obscure collections, but it's called Logical Positivism, and he discusses the positivist movement. And obviously he was a founding member of that movement, and he was in the Vienna Circle. But when Hitler came to power in Germany, because a lot of these guys are Germans, they left the US, and they left Europe, and they ended up in the different American universities. So the homogeneity, if you like, the coherence of the movement disintegrated, but there was a lot of the different American universities became centres of this thought. A lot of the people, like Carnap was at UCLA, and they basically became dispersed throughout the American universities. So there was still a lot of positivistic thought. Or when Quine, who was an intimate collaborator with Carnap, who was one of the founding members of the positive movement, when Quine published his Two Dogmas, he really that represented the end of, because the movement in itself, the Vienna Circle, had fragmented, but Quine represented the end of it as an intellectual movement of a stream of philosophy. Ayer did his best until I think he wrote another compendium. I think he was still 1968. I think he wrote a compendium of logical positivist thought. But Ayer by that point had recognised the limitations of the view. And even though even now there's still some who argue for a verification principle, and there is a very interesting take on the verification principle that results from the work of McDowell in his Mind and World, and some people have tried to justify the verification principle as a transcendental rather than as a empiricist principle. They're trying to justify it as a transcendental principle, so which would in a sense legitimize it. Now that's almost where I ended when I was discussing this when I discuss it in my book, when I summarise some of the work, because one of the objections to transcendental arguments is that in order to connect conceptual how you think about the world with the way the world really is, the transcendentalist would have to, Stroud said that the transcendentalist would have to import in some form of verification principle, because it's one thing to have to be, for it to be logically necessary to think about the world in a particular way, but it's another thing to say that it's logically necessary that the world is actually that way. And so he was saying that transcendentalism still has this problem. It has to import in some form of verificationism for it to connect our concepts with the real world. Now, some have argued that coming out of McDowell's work, that there was a transcendental derivation of the verification principle. There's some sort of justification for it, which would mean that it's not a dogmatic or axiomatic starting point like it was for the logical positivists, but it's something that's derived as transcendentally necessary, which is obviously very, very, which would be a profound resurrection of the verification principle. But verificationism, which is favoured by it had in some philosophy of religion, there's a big anthology by someone called what are they called? I will put it in the description, but it's a very popular anthology, and it has an article by Michael Martin, who was a very energetic atheist. He wasn't like he was a little bit more sophisticated than the new atheists, Dawkins and Dennett and Harris, and when you remember, I think I mentioned the one. I remembered, I was trying to think who the four horsemen of the apocalypse, but I remember three of them now. It's Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and someone else who I would have to look. But they were very, very crude, very, very aggressive atheist fundamentalists. Michael Martin was more like somebody who's a bit more sophisticated. He was still quite crude and in some of his thought, but he's a tenured professor. But he was somebody that, even though verificationism is considered philosophically in disrepute, he was somebody that nevertheless was prepared to argue for a form of verificationism when he was discussing belief in God. So, which was amazing, really. It is again. It's an irony is that you get a lot of aggressive atheist intellectuals who in the sense who only because they're writing and discussing philosophy of religion, they actually they're earning their keep by arguing with philosophers of religion. I find it supremely ironic that you're trying to dismiss God by talking about God. So, but that again, you see a connection between your metaphysics, your epistemology, and your ethics, and how you live your life. So, okay, so I think I'm getting a bit hoarse. So I'll chop this into two different bits. So there's three. It's just I think it's a nice overview in the sense of analytical philosophy. Just to summarise, comes out of there were analytical philosophers early on, like I say, people like just over there. But so Hume was an early analyst. So there were early analysts, but it disappeared after Kant. Kant, in many ways, it was like that was the idealists really came out of Kant and the Hegelians and interpretation of Kant. If you weren't an intuitionist and you wanted to revise rationalism, but with the work of Moore and Frege sort of put with his work with mathematics, philosophy of mathematics, opened up a new way, a non-Hegelian view, and in fact, in opposition to Hegel. That was picked up by Russell. Moore and Russell argued. Moore gave us a rigorous analytical method. Be clear with what you're saying, how you're saying it. If you can't be clear, then you're not talking. We need to get units of clarity. So that was the first phase of analytical philosophy, was be clear about what you're saying. And then the second phase, which we haven't really talked about much, maybe we should actually, maybe I can manage another 20 minutes to talk about the second phase. When people, first of all, that logical positivist, early logical positivist, they were really emphasizing the perfect, the idea of being able to use the logic of Frege, decode normal language into this perfect, refined language that would then generate solutions to philosophical problems. Now, if you read any of Carnap's attempts on this, when you read some of his sort of early work where he's talking about semines and it's hard work, and Carnap is probably the person that really pushed that sort of like idea. He's like his Aufbau, the logical structure of the world. He was one that really was the one that really tried to take that work on, tried to build on the logical atomism of Russell and Wittgenstein. He really tried together, but it failed. There's no doubt about it. It failed. The idea that you can render normal human language as this perfect, logically pure language expressing these perfect propositions. That failed. Now the second, perhaps more interesting, and whereas logical positivism sort of like crumpled under the criticism of Quine, Wittgenstein was very, very interesting, because during the 30s he was starting, his view of language and the way language worked started to change very dramatically. And by the end of the, when after the Second World War, after that hiatus when he was doing research, and he went back into philosophy again, he started to talk about that the meaning of a language, this is I think one of the most profoundest insights of the 20th century, which is why it was such a revolutionary thought, was that he said that the meaning of a language, rather than trying to derive it from some sort of logicistic base like Frege and the logical positivists, that rather than trying to derive it from that base, he was saying that the use of a language, what gives a language meaning, it says that meaning is defined by its use within a community. That's what gives it the meaning. And so that gave rise to so rather than trying to generate this perfect logical language, the second phase of the analytic philosophy movement was very much concerned with how the language, it was called, in Wittgenstein's, when Wittgenstein was the movement that when he was at Oxford, it became the Oxford Ordinary Language Philosophers. So because he was connected with Cambridge, but the Oxford school that took on his work and were influenced by his work, they became they were, for whatever reason, associated with Oxford, and there were ordinary language philosophers like Austin and Ryle, and people that were very interested, who were very much influenced by his view of language and language being defined within a community. Because one of the things Wittgenstein would say, well, when we in ordinary language talk about time, what time, well, which time we're going, what time you're going to be there, he said that there's no problem with understanding what you mean, but he said for some reason when philosophers say what is time, it suddenly becomes really, really complicated. And so he said that so in the second phase of the analytical, the ordinary language philosophers, the thing that drove them was that if we just concentrate on the way language is used, then we just clarify in the sense and understand how the language is being used, and then we can clean it up just by we can make it clear with how the language is actually being used. And so that's what's called a therapeutic. It was the therapeutic view of the purpose of philosophy. So philosophy is nothing to do with. In fact, philosophy can't really solve any sort of problems. All it's doing is making it clear what the problems are, and then delegating the solution to any of those problems to perhaps thinkers or politicians or cultural intellectuals or the different domains of human life. They're just making it clear, well, these are the problems that you need to solve. Because what they were saying that is because the ordinary language, in the sense, cloaks it, or because of the community's use of language, it can be difficult to see what the actual problem is. And so the flow that came out of that, the use of and the use of the ordinary language, that ordinary language movement, its central thing was to clarify. Now there is, alongside that, there was also people like Ryle who they had a little bit more of a transcendental flavour to their philosophy. So they were saying that when you look in language and you look at the way it's used, when you use the word good, the only reason you understand what the word good means is because you got the reference of it being bad, or vice versa, bad is you good, or right and wrong. And he was saying these things, that was what he called polar opposites. So he's saying that within the structure of language itself, you've got this polar opposites, and this is what helps to give language its meaning. And so those also flowed out of that movement. And it became, and when I know I've mentioned in a previous video, when in the 1960s, when Strawson took on he started to argue intentionally in a transcendental way, neo-Kantian. So he took some of those insights of that period, and then came, in a sense, had presented like a revised Kantianism, which was quite ironic, really, in the sense of, the analytical tradition once was concerned so much, right, let's clear out this language, get rid of this Kantian nonsense, clear out philosophy, get rid of this metaphysical baggage. 1950s come. Oh no, we can't get rid of we can't get rid of metaphysics. After all, metaphysics has got a role to play. And as soon as you allow the role to play, and as soon as the logical positivists were discredited as incoherent and actually based on metaphysical dogma, you then have the reintroduction of metaphysics and a role for metaphysics in science. Now, a scientific metaphysics, I will do something on this sort of relation between science and metaphysics and what science does to meta, and a respectable, how do you make metaphysics respectable? Because if you remember Hume's great thing, his great dismissal of metaphysics, saying any of these cast into the flames, any of these books, have they got anything, no number in? No. Have they got any scientific reasoning in? No. Have they got, well, just chuck them all in the fire, in the flames. He was a librarian as well. So it was like, all these books of school metaphysics, all this religious nonsense, chuck it in the fire, burn it all up. And yet now, you have to, this metaphysics is somehow being, no, you can't dismiss it. It's not. So, how Quine's naturalism and the naturalism that flowed out of this, what role and what place has meant, how can metaphysics have a place in a scientific philosophy? And that's something we, I'll study. We'll dedicate a video looking on that, in a sense of issues within the philosophy of science, and how what does metaphysics do? What metaphysical issues are still important within science, and so you can see. So we're progressing on with the sort of like with the idea that philosophy and science, they're not. You mentioned a bit that they're not separate, they're not distinct. They're part of the same. They're part of the same discussion. They're part of the process of human knowledge, and that's why I call my work epistemological self-conscious, because knowledge, theory of knowledge, epistemology, theory of knowledge. Unless you can see how all these parts fit together and remain coherent, and you're not ending up contradicting yourself a little bit further down the road. A lot of problems with philosophy, when you look at people's commitments and they say, well, this is what I'm committed to, but if you follow out their commitments, they contradict themselves a bit further along. That's called the problem of coherence in philosophy, does your metaphysics fit with your epistemology, what you assume about reality and the objects of reality, and then in your theory of the world, are they consistent with your ethics? If you're not, we all have the problem of being able to live consistently with our knowledge, but we would nevertheless say, oh well, but I'm aware of how they should fit together. And whereas part of the flavour of modern philosophy has been there is no way of fitting together, there is no rhyme, there is no reason, everything's subjective and everything is relative. I can just make my own way. Very much the spirit of existentialism. There is no public answers to any problem. The only answers I'm going to have to any problems are going to be private ones. I need to live my life the way I want to live my life. The only problem is we have things called governments and globalists and transhumanists and everything, who, if you don't, they will live their life for you. You will be eventually living life. If there is a place in their wonderful new utopia, they are going to be choosing how you live your life. You're not going to be living your life the way you want to live your life. Remember something I said in one of the first, I think maybe my first video, was that if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for everything. So you need to have some sort of coherent philosophy that allows you to tie those things together, that gives you some foundation. Okay, so so thank you very much. That's nice. That gives me a shorter 20-minute roundup of the sequence. I'll split this one into 3 bits. Okay, but that was just an introduction to analysis and the analytical tradition. And in contrast to the continental tradition, I will put a couple of references for people who are interested in the continental, because that's not my area of expertise. And unless I do some refresher reading and some listening with regards to that, I wouldn't be able to present anything vaguely to the level to try and help people understand what continental philosophy is all about. But there's a couple of great introductions to continental philosophy, because that's such a broad brush. It's a bit like analytic philosophy. It's such a broad term, but they are two very distinct ways of looking at the West within the Western tradition, in addition to yet another completely different way of what we would call Eastern philosophy. But we saw in people like Schopenhauer and other people like, say, Jung, the psychologist Jung, how they were influenced by Eastern thought in their thought. So we need to understand that even when we say Western and Eastern philosophy, we're still using big broad brushes, and we don't understand that these are cross-pollinated each other. You know, in Arabic, the Arabic philosophers had read Aristotle, and they had a particular take on Aristotle, and there was this interchange between there's this interchange between different philosophical traditions. So we although Western and Eastern are useful as generic terms, just as analytical and continental are useful as for terms of sort of like understanding some ideas. As you dig down and as you bury, it's not as simple as sometimes that's in the sense when you start to analyse in the analytic way of philosophy itself. You break it down into different bits. You see, it's not they're not neat categories. People have been influenced by some of the people who are enormously influential in, say, in the British empiricist tradition and in the 19th century. People like John Stuart Mill, he wrote the book On Liberty, which is one of the greatest statements of political philosophy ever. You know, it's a foundational. It's something everybody should read. But the idea that people have natural rights and that the government, his starting point was that the government should be involved to the people should be allowed to do what they want to do with the minimum interference from government. He starts from that point of view that government should be minimised. How do we justify allowing government to do more? You know, it's a foundational document within one of the most important books ever written with regards to there. But he was known as an empiricist, and his father was one of the founders of the utilitarian movement. Frederick Bentham, the great utilitarian movement, people who were very were considered very scientific, very rationalistic, very they were influential figures in changing the world. But he said that he was personally influenced very much by some of the English Romantic poets, and so you don't, and you think, well, what was it about the Romantic poets that expressed itself in his work? And so it's like it's so useful, and so it's so important that when we're trying to understand our world and understand our society, understand our politics, and the people who are very influential within our cultures are, what were their influences? Why, where we end up now is a result of the philosophies that have preceded us, and of the values and the principles and the ethics that flow out of that. So philosophy is about life and living life. Okay, so Father, in the name of Jesus, lots and lots and lots of thoughts and flow of consciousness today. Lord, anybody that reads it, anybody that listens, anybody that's provoked a study, I pray this would be a rich source of inspiration for people, that they can want to read and want to study and move on in philosophy. Think about life rather than just exist. Amen. Okay, so God bless. See you again soon.